back. Well, first off, I do want to say don't buy the M1 Ultra. It's a waste of money. $5 grand, way overpriced. Cut it in half, even I'd buy one. But then you'd have to cut in price the M1 Max. I'd buy one of them too. Anyway, I wouldn't give Apple $5 grand for this machine. However, I do have some good news for you people. I've cracked the code. I'm pretty sure. We all been wondering how much video RAM is actually in the M1 systems, right? So I think I've got the code cracked, and it's pretty interesting. Okay, so we all know that originally, well, not originally, but all the time, everybody tests Shadow the Tomb Raider, right? Because it wants 6 gigs of video for an NVIDIA card, 8 gigs if it's an AMD. It wants medium graphics and a 1080p for the PC, and it wants a quad core at about 3.4 gigahertz. Okay, we only have 3.2 gigahertz per processor core in the Ultras and the M1Xs and the M1s, right? So that's our performance cores are 3.2, not 3.4. So that's, 200 megahertz shy times 4. Now, the game is not going to use more cores really than what it needs on the top settings, right? So, but when it comes to graphics, right, it wants a 6 gig video card. Now, I don't know how many cores or CUDA cores are sitting in an actual graphic card from NVIDIA for their 6 gig card without looking it up. I'd have to look it up, but I think I've cracked the code from Apple. See, we've all been wondering how much video RAM we actually have accessible to us in these Macs, and Apple won't tell us anything. Nobody tells us anything other than I found a website said 5 gigs, another one said 5.5. Some guy on one of these machines says we got a lot. Well, what the heck's that tell us? Nothing, right? But the game wants 6 gigs to play recommended, right? Or 1 gig if you only have the minimum specs, right? All right, so let's do some math here. So I'm going to pull up my calculator. I have a game, 2 games actually. I have Fallout Las Vegas. It says that it's an NVIDIA 8600, I believe it is, at 768 megs, 132 cores. Fallout 3 says it's an NVIDIA 8500 at half a gig at 32 CUDA cores. Okay, let's just say it's the half a gig, just to make our brains simplified. Okay. Now, we have a 48-core GPU. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit of basic electronics to you guys because it's very important because it applies to this. If you take 2 12-volt batteries, okay, and you hook positive to positive and negative to negative, and then you take those those 2 cables at the end, you'll still end up with one positive, one negative. Now, you still have 12 volts, okay? All you've done is increase the amperage load so you can draw more amperage. So each battery is good for 1,000 amps. So now you have 2,000 amps, right? Talking car batteries. But at 12 volts. Now, if you tie a battery, a positive from one battery to the negative of the other, and the positive of another battery to the negative of the other, you'll still end up with one positive, one negative cable in the end. But what's happened here is you've left your amperage still at 1,000 amps, but you've doubled your voltage. Okay? You following me so far? So you go from 12 to 24. It's called a series connection. So what Apple has done here is they've series connected their GPUs. So you have 48 core GPU. Each GPU, if it's good for 512 megs of video power, times that by 48 cores, in this case of the base model Ultra, right? That's 24 gigs of video power. Now remember, you got 64 gigs of RAM in here. Okay? Now, that still leaves you, if we take 64 and we minus, you dumb thing, 64 minus 24. That still leaves us 40 gigs of RAM. And we've used all of our video RAM up. But we got 24 gigs of video, right? Now keep in mind, this is integrated graphics. Now integrated graphics is a lot less horsepower or amperage than a dedicated video card. Okay? But we have 40 gigs. Now, let's remove, on OS 12.3, we use 4.44, but we're going to round it off to 4.5 gigs of RAM. Okay, so if we minus 4.5 from 40, that leaves us 35.5 gigabytes of RAM free to run whatever programs we want. Okay, so we have a total availability of 24 gigs worth of video power, and we have our 4.5 gigs for our OS, because the OS isn't going to use anything more than that currently with 12.3. We still have 35.5 gigs left over out of that 64 gigs of RAM to do whatever we want with programs. Now, that was based on Fallout 3 saying that my video card was an NVIDIA at 512. Okay, now Las Vegas Fallout 3 says it's a 768. Now, if we take 768, this you'll find interesting, times just 2 cores, that's 1.5 gigs. Looking familiar to you yet? It should, because the majority of Mac laptops over the last several years have come with how much video RAM? 1.5 gig. 1.5 gigs, right? So, oh, I can't believe it took like 30 hours of trying to do this video, and I finally figured out the science behind this, I'm sure. I'm really sure I figured it out. Okay, so now remember 48 cores. 768 times 48 cores is 36 gigs worth of video power. Now, be it's going to be slower because, you know, the game wants a real video card at 6 gigs of an NVIDIA or 8 gigs of AMD. If you look up the PC specs. Now, here's where we're losing our FPS. Okay? Is not just because it's integrated video, we are losing some FPS, but we're really losing FPS because the game on the PC side wants an Intel i7-7760, which is 3.4 gigahertz. Our performance cores are only 3.2 gigahertz. So the game is not going to demand at the recommended specs more than a quad core, apparently. Okay, so that's an 800 megahertz loss because we don't have 4 cores at 3.4. We're only going to be using 4 cores at 3.2, which does explain why the M1 Ultra can only pull off about 115 to 120 FPS out of the game at 1080p at medium settings. Now, you remember the M1 was tested, the original M1 Mac Mini, MacBook Airs, you know, with their 8-core CPU, 8-core GPU, with the same game, and we're getting a lot less FPS. Okay, like they still had to turn down the settings even lower in the medium settings to get it a little bit better, to still get, what was it, 65 FPS or 60 FPS, something like that. It was playable, but could have been better. Right now, the M1 Max, I think it was, or the M1 Pro. Well, the M1 Max I know was recently tested in this studio, and it was at 95 frames per second. Okay, compared to the 115 on the Ultra. Now at 24 cores at 512 times 24 cores, that's 12 gigs of video on the 24 core GPU. If you were to go by 512, okay, if you went by 768 per core available video RAM, okay, and you times that by 24, you would have 18 gigs of video. Now, again, integrated video to the chip runs slower. But again, we still have the same bottleneck. These CPU cores are only at 3.2. The game wants a 3.4. Okay, so it's an 800 megahertz still lost across 4 cores. We don't get to use more cores than what the game demands. Okay, we don't get to use more video than what the game demands in total, right? So, and the PC specs are based upon medium graphics, 1080p. Okay, and that's the CPU was a quad core i7 7770. Okay, at 3.4 gigahertz, right? And a 6-core NVIDIA card or 8-core or 8 gig AMD, because you need more AMD video, because I guess maybe it's because it's a slower card than the NVIDIA. See, NVIDIA's got the gaming graphics industry tied up. They're like the best for the gaming, right? But both my games that I wine wrapped that were PC versioned games of Fallout were wine wrapped to run on the Mac through the porting kit. And so it checks your machine specs. Oh yeah, very high. But, you know, it's not going to run things at high settings very well. You know, you could drop things down, get a little bit more horsepower. You suffered a little bit of graphics. But either way, it still said, you know, the one game it said, Fallout 3 said that it was, you know, a half a gig. And Las Vegas said that it was 768. But we're only working on cores of GPU cores. And we're all trying to rock our brains around, like, how much video? Now, this video power, too, by the way, is going to be dictated to on your RAM. So if you only have an 8 gig machine, okay, this is where things get weird. If you only have 8 gigs of RAM in your machine, which most people were testing on, even with the M1 Mini, right? So at that point in time, we were like OS 11, which was Big Sur. 12 originally was like 4 gigs. So that's half your RAM gone, right? So let's just say half your RAM's gone. That's 4 gigs. So your OS chews 4 gigs. It's not going to chew up more than that, right? So your program needs RAM. But then your video RAM is sucked right back, right? Because technically you should have, you know, 4 gigs of RAM, but left over, which you do, and you have an 8-core GPU. But if you have 512 even, you know, and you times that by 8, that's 4 gigs. You're out. You're running everything off the swap space, which you would be. You'd have to run the rest of the game off swap space, which meant you dropped a really bad FPS. Now, the drives are so fast in these things, you don't really see much of a performance hit there. So you wouldn't get the greatest FPS out of the game. You'd have to turn the settings down even lower, which we saw happen, right? So it all makes sense now. Okay, no, I'm not on a caffeine buzz. I wish I was. But I thought I'd share this with you guys because I think I've cracked their code here on how much video power we actually have. And it is relative to RAM. Now, we can go to 16 gigs of RAM in the M1s. And I'm pretty sure some people tested 16 gigs and got a little bit better FPS out of the game. So if we take 16, oops, we don't need the period in there. So if we take 16 gigs and we minus out 4 gigs, right, for, 4 gigs for the OS. Well, 4.5 now with the new 12.3 update. So minus out, okay, so we take 16 and we minus 4.5 gigs worth of RAM for the OS. That leaves us 11.5 gigs. Now, on 11.5 gigs, if we minused out, see, we've got 8 cores. It's a gig for every 2 cores, 2 gigs, 4 gigs. We minus out 4 gigs. So minus out 4 gigs, right? If it was 512, right? So minus out 4 gigs. That still leaves you with 7.5 gigs to run your programs with. Pretty interesting, right? But if we were to do that at 768, so if we took 11.5 and we minused out at 768, so every 768 for every 2 is a gig and a half. So getting it a half times 2 is 3 gigs. That's 6 gigs. So minus 6 gigs. So minus 6, that's 5.5 gigs left over for the programs. And that's pretty much what I'm seeing even in Minecraft, right? I'm seeing numbers like that in Minecraft. And it's like, that's so friggin' cool. right? So I'm pretty sure we've cracked the code here, but it is relative to how much RAM you have, to how many cores you have, how much video RAM you're going to have, okay, and whether or not you're going to end up going into swap, which we've seen all the time on base model Macs. They're always going into swap, right? Because even Minecraft, if you launch Minecraft on an 8 gig M1, you're already at like 8 gigs of RAM plus, right? Because after even a couple of minutes of flying around, we saw that on my video. We're like we're going into the 9 gig territory, right? So, but on a 16 gig machine, after 1 hour of pounding blocks and building stuff, I was only using up a grand total of 11 point something gigs of RAM out of 16, right? So I still could have been using a little bit more, but I still would have never gone into swap space, likely on Minecraft, at least not until I built my world really massive. Then I might go closer to that 16 gigs, you know? Because Minecraft, as you guys know, is a rendering hog. And as you render graphics forward, anything behind you is still pre-rendered and stuck into memory. So it'll slowly grow even more and more. So when you turn around, it's instantaneous, boom, it's in your face, right? But as you keep flying forward, you're rendering more and more graphics in your world. You're rendering more and more graphics as you're building stuff, tearing down stuff, and so on, right? Actually tearing down, you're reducing. So it actually is keeping a balance. So, kind of neat. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I'm going to go eat dinner now because, yeah, I'm hungry. See ya.